Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Lisa Olligus, your host. In this edition, we bring focus to voter registration. In particular, registering college-age students and young adults as voters. We'll be talking with student writers with The Chart, MSSU's award-winning newspaper, who are tackling the topic of voter registration among college students, the county clerks from Jasper and Newton County, Missouri, about the reality of who votes, and the rules and upcoming deadlines, and we will get perspective from MSSU Professor of International and Political Affairs, Dr. Will Delahanty. Now, recently, the League of Women Voters of the Greater Joplin area were on the Missouri Southern campus as part of National Voter Registration Day. The event was coordinated by the Minnehackney Community Service Center. The Lion's Den was one of 3 registration events. Joining me now are 2 of our communications students. Morgan Shields is a junior majoring in both mass communications and public relations, and sophomore Jasmine Knight, also double majoring, good for you guys, in mass communications, public relations, and a minor in entrepreneurship. Welcome.
Hi, thank you for having us.
You're welcome. So let's begin with your assignment from The Chart, our newspaper. You each had a different focus. Morgan, what were you hoping to learn about?
So I was hoping to learn more about students and their opinions on voting and what their plans are, because I have never personally voted before. So I kind of wanted to see where my peers are at on that, because I know a lot of people are like me and just haven't. It's an anxiety thing. Don't want to. It's scary to go out there and actually vote. So
yeah.
So
you talked to the students.
Yeah.
What kind of reactions did you get?
I felt like a lot of them kind of said they were planning on voting, but it was more because they didn't want to seem like they didn't care. But a lot of students there, I talked to some super passionate people who were just either passionate about not voting, which was odd. I had never encountered that viewpoint before, or very passionate about it's your civic duty and just believing that, it's what we should do and knowing about what's going on.
So what were the reasons they give for saying they didn't want to vote?
Some people were just like, it's not, our vote doesn't matter, so why would we vote? And they're not people who are directly affecting us, so they didn't believe that it was what was right for them.
Wow. So you were talking about some of the numbers, and we're going to get back to that. But Jasmine, you were asking the whys, those why questions. So what did you get when you talked to the other students?
Well, a lot of students, I found out that they just didn't know what was on the ballot, and that really gave them a lot of anxiety and fear about voting. And like she said, a lot of students haven't voted before. So one of the things that I wrote about was the importance of why is it important to vote? Why is it important to get out there and be at the polls and everything like that? And even when I did my research and I talked to a Joplin council member, and he explained to me the importance and why it's so important, and why especially young people need to get out there, because it affects us in our daily life in local and small elections and stuff like that, and not just presidential elections.
So what did you learn motivates students to vote? I mean, did they say?
Really, I found stickers. I voted stickers really motivate people. But mainly it's just they want to see the change that they're voting for. So, for example, I know on the ballot for this November is the medical marijuana and stuff like that. People want to see that change and want to see their lives affected by that in their daily life.
So very issue-oriented,
yes,
rather than maybe a specific candidate that they may or may not know.
Yes, correct.
And did they admit that they really weren't well-versed in what the ballot measure is, or who the people were?
A lot of them did not know, and they were willing to find out and research it, but a lot of students just don't know where to start, where those resources are, or what even to look up.
So when you talk to folks, were they already registered? Were they considering registering? What kind of feedback did you get?
So actually 75% were already registered to vote, but only I think it was 60, I don't have the number right here, 60% were planning on voting. So it was just kind of even if they were registered, you register whenever you get your license when you turn 18, and never end up using it or haven't used it yet.
They don't take advantage of their right to vote.
Yeah.
Did you learn why they might have, were there obstacles for them to voting, that they had maybe an issue that would result in them not being able to vote?
Yeah, so a lot of students around here are not, or living on campus at Missouri Southern, aren't from the 4-state area, or even if they are from the 4 states, they're 2 hours away from where they want to vote, where they would have to vote, and can't make it up there on election day. So the process of getting an absentee ballot they don't feel like going through that process or don't know how to approach going through it, so they don't do it.
So that's something they need to learn more about, is how to make absentee voting happen and how they can do that in a timely fashion. Did you hear anything that surprised you? Either one of you. Jasmine?
Mainly what surprised me is just that a lot of people just don't know. And I feel like now with like social media and different things, we have different outlets so we can learn about different things, but it's not being pushed towards us. It's mainly being pushed towards like, you know, the older audiences and stuff like that. But a lot of our candidates, we don't know anything about the issues, we don't know anything about, and it's just simply because it's not in front of us.
Do you think part of it is their focus is on other parts of life, or like you mentioned the CBD, the medical marijuana? Is that a certain issue that, they might have an interest in? Do they need to know what issues are on the ballot more so that they might be interested?
Yes, for sure. Especially with, you know, issues like that, and like parks, for example, or something that, you know, could be voted on, or just different things in the city. Like, I know a lot of people think that Joplin doesn't have anything to do. So I know when I talked to the councilman, he was like, a lot of businesses, we vote on stuff that businesses want, such as internet and stuff like that. If we don't have good internet in Joplin, then businesses don't want to come to us. And so if students knew that and knew that was the reason why we don't have a lot of things to do, I think that would influence them to vote more.
And then you were doing some of the number crunching and comparing us nationally. Are college students here similar in voting attitudes as to the rest of the country? What'd you learn?
So a lot of more Missouri Southern students said they planned on voting in this upcoming election than showed. I think it was 10% more students said they planned on it than what the previous midterm election had shown, and I think that's all we had.
So you said the obstacles might be that they don't necessarily live close enough to home, so absentee balloting might be an issue. Why do you personally think it's important to vote?
I think it's important to vote because there are things like, this sounds kind of ageist, but older Americans, they're further through their life, and the things that are being voted on right now are what's going to affect us for the rest of our lives. Like, we're just starting out. So this is stuff we're going to have to live with for, you know, the rest of our life.
What do you think, Jasmine? And do you think that's a message other college students get?
Yeah, I think going off of what you said, especially like with us, and then like when we get old enough to start having kids and stuff like that, like things like school boards and stuff like that is going to be important when our kids go to school. So like you say, it's not just things that are going to affect the older generations. It affects us and the generations after us and after us that we need to start thinking about now.
Do you feel like the students you talked to felt like they have a voice?
Not really. They kind of felt like passed over, or just they didn't care to have a voice right now.
Because they aren't motivated to do it.
We're young, and most of us aren't working, so taxes aren't really affecting us and that sort of thing. It's just not really important to us right now, I guess, or most students right now.
Well, hopefully we'll hear more about that from our county clerks. Thank you both for joining us and your research. Good job, and we look forward to seeing your articles.
Thank you.
Thank you. When we come back, we'll be joined by our area county clerks for a reality check on who turns out at the polls and what you need to know when you go to vote. Coming up. Welcome back to Newsmakers. Charlie Davis was elected county clerk in 2018 and has presided over 15 elections since taking office. Tammy Owens is the Newton County Clerk, also elected in 2018. She has served on the Republican Central Committee for 18 years. Well, they welcome you two. Our students recently focused on the concept of college students and voting, and when it comes to those groups, how well represented are younger voters and those in college when you see our turnouts? Can you tell?
Well, number one, we have no idea the number of young voters that actually vote. We don't track that kind of mechanism, but you can look at the involvement in the community. It looks like that the vast majority of our college kids are not really engaged in the political spectrum, and especially are not out voting on election day. But I don't think that's necessarily the fault of the college students. It is something that we see quite frequently, especially when You look at some of the April elections when you have less than 10% of the people show up to vote. Or in one election that we had a couple years ago, we had 97 people come for a water district election. So it's apathy. You know, a lot of people sometimes, I think we heard from the two students that some people don't think that their vote matters. But I would like to let everybody understand that it does matter, especially La Russell. You remember the story about La Russell where nobody in the city voted 2 years ago for 2 council members and whether they wanted to join the fire protection district. So when you don't think that your voice matters, one person could have changed the outcome of that election.
Yes.
And then in Carterville, we had 2 races that was won by 1 vote. So absolutely, 1 vote does matter in these elections.
And you mentioned April. I mean, there are students who might get motivated in a presidential race. You know, you have young Democrats, young Republicans. They might say, get out the vote. But April elections are actually very local and personal, Tammy. And what are some of the things decided in April elections that kind of make them important and why we should all care and vote?
Typically, the municipalities have things on the ballot. You're talking school board elections, city councilmen, things of that nature. And Charlie's correct. I mean, we've had the same thing happen in our county. Usually it is less than 10%. And this last April, we had one gentleman that lost by 6 votes.
Wow.
So your vote really does matter. And as far as absentee ballots, for college students, we do have a lot of absentee ballots that go out to people that are home based. Their residence is in Newton County, and they do apply for absentee ballots. They can get the application off of our webpage, which is www.newtoncountymo.com, and they go to offices, county clerk, and then at the very bottom it says resources, and they can actually print an absentee ballot request out there. They can do that every election, and we'll send them their application. If they want to vote on the issues, they can look it up also, same webpage, sample ballot, so they can research that a little bit
So
before they
absentee
make
is
their...
not as hard as some people might make it out. I mean,
No.
you just have to prepare. You have to plan ahead.
Yes. Yeah, we make it relatively easy because they have the right to vote. We want to make sure that they get to exercise that.
I'd like to talk briefly about active versus inactive voters. There was a recent story done. You know, how many people are registered, but there's a portion of them that actually don't participate. How true is that in yours?
Jasper County has about 126,000 citizens in the county. We have 81,000 total registered voters, but only 69,000 are active voters. 69,000 have actually voted within the last 2 federal elections.
So just a little more than half the population.
It's a little more than half the population. And I think that's a good point. We have a lot of people that talk about our bloated voter rolls. You know, Tammy and I, every 2 years we do something that we're required to do by law, and that's called the census and the canvas, where we go out and we mail all registered voters in our counties a piece of paper. And if it comes back as undeliverable from the post office, then we start the process of cleaning it up to make sure that our voter rolls are clear. But we do make sure that we don't just arbitrarily remove people from the voter rolls. I think Tammy and I do realize that we follow the laws, so we don't just do that. But we are a little bit bloated sometimes, but you know, we just want to make sure that everybody who has the ability to register does.
Tammy, what's the situation when it comes to your population? How many are registered and how many are actually active?
We actually have around 42,000 registered voters. 37,359 are active currently, and 4,784 are inactive. And it's roughly the same thing. You know, the Secretary of State's office sends down reports for us to clean our voter rolls. You know, you've got the death report where we have to remove deceased voters, and then also felony convictions that are not allowed to vote.
Right. So, you know, how important is it that voters give you a change of address, for one? I mean, is that really important?
Oh, yes.
It's vital.
You know, if people would just come in and give us your change of address, very quickly after you move, it would make our lives so much easier. We would not be getting all this mail undeliverable because we send it to your old address. So I think if they would just do that, it would make it so much easier for us, and those voter rolls would be clear.
And themselves.
And
Because
themselves.
then they don't have to say, I'm living somewhere else. Then there is something that Missouri has now. There is a requirement for photo ID, correct?
Correct.
So tell us all the different kinds of IDs that would be appropriate that people can bring. 'Cause
Well,
it's
I
not
think-
just a driver's license,
No,
right?
it's not just a driver's license. The key thing is non-expired. It has to be a non-expired Missouri driver's license, Missouri photo ID,
Non-driver's
license,
passport,
military ID,
All those
if you have a veteran's ID card, anything that is issued by the federal government or the state of Missouri that has your photo on it.
And then what are the current deadlines for registering to vote if somebody still needs to register?
For the November 8th election, it is October 12th. And then the last deadline for sending out absentee is 2 Wednesdays before the election, which I think is the 27th, October 27th.
And one final question. What is no excuse absentee voting? What is that?
Well, as of now, in order to absentee vote, you have to have a reason. I'm going to be out of town. I'm a doctor. I'm a firefighter. I'm a physician. I am a poll worker, whatever the case may be. You have to have a reason. We do not just have open voting for everybody, or early voting. What the law this last year that was passed changes is 2 weeks before the election, which is November 8th, you can actually vote absentee for any reason.
Okay.
And also, the state requires us to be open the Saturday before an election from, I believe, 8 to noon.
8 to noon.
And people can come in and vote at that time if they
And then-
can't get there, Monday through
And
Friday.
in-person absentee voting is all the way up until 5 p.m. Monday, the day before the election. So November 7th, 5 p.m. that Monday, you can still come to our office at the courthouse in Carthage or the courts building in Joplin, as well as
Newton
The
County.
Newton County.
Newton County, and all the way up until 5 p.m. Monday, the day before the election.
Not
You
as
can
hard as
absentee
people
vote.
think.
It's not hard at all.
Exercise your right. Well, thank you both for sharing that
Thank you.
information with us. We really appreciate you. And when Newsmakers returns, we will talk to Professor Will Delahanty about the issues that have drawn people to the polls, particularly young voters. We'll be back. Our final guest is Dr. William Delahanty, MSSU Professor of International and Political Affairs, Graduate Coordinator of Justice Studies in the Masters of Science program. Thank you for joining us. We've been talking to our students about voter registration, taking part in voting. Historically, have college-age voters been motivated to engage in the process, and what seems to motivate them?
Well, it's a good question. So when the federal constitution was amended, right, to lower the voting age, right, to 18, I think the expectation was that people who were younger would be much more likely to participate because you had that formal limit reduced. It turns out historically that the rates of the young voting have not actually materialized in the way that we would think. There have been, I think, recent elections where the political participation of the young, I think, are really important and matters. 2008, I think, is a good one with the election of Barack Obama. The interesting question is what issues, as you mentioned, motivate the young. And it seems like our government has a tendency to focus on issues related to other age brackets in the electorate. So questions of Social Security and Medicare, and less about issues that would potentially be relevant for the young. But the thing that's interesting about the academic literature is that it's not entirely clear what those issues would be. More recently with President Biden's decisions regarding student loan forgiveness.
That's right.
Yeah, you would think that might be a motivating issue. It's hard to know what those issues would be specifically, only because it's not always clear what the young's interests are.
Right. So, but I was going to ask you, do tactics like that work? I mean, it was a strategy. Everyone said, it's to get that, we were in the midterm elections. He wanted people to be motivated. Sure. And the loan forgiveness did affect a large number of people. But young voters, are they even aware that the loan forgiveness is only a sort of retroactive
Sure.
kind of deal?
Right.
Can those strategies be misleading at all when a politician puts that out there of, we're going to do this?
Yes, I think so. I mean, it can be misleading in the sense that, I mean, as you're saying, it wouldn't apply to people who are currently taking loans or who would take loans into the future. So it could be misleading in that sense. And so I could see the point of view that it's a political move to boost participation, particularly in a midterm election where other indicators are suggesting that the House and the Senate may shift, right, to the to the Republicans. But it is interesting when you reference education. I mean, you would think educational policies designed to benefit, in this case, borrowers or people who go to school, would be a motivating factor. One of the things that is really interesting is the notion of somehow paying for public higher education, right, through governmental, provision.
They've mentioned community colleges
Right.
possibly becoming free at
Right.
some point.
Right. I mean, so it would seem like it would matter for those people who are most engaged in the educational process.
Right.
And it would benefit the candidate who would make those kinds of claims. But in the same way, to say, for example, that public education, higher education would be free, is misleading in the sense that it's not free, that it does cost money, and so those people who would benefit from it obviously get the education, but it still has to be paid for. So I think to your
Somebody
point,
has to pay for it.
Right. So there is the potential for misleading people and to pursue it maybe for short-term political goals. But having said that, I'm not entirely sure that it always works in the way that a candidate like Biden.
Hopes it does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so, do we have ideas, I mean, from your experiences with students in the class, learning about government, it does sound like from what our students said, a lot of students are not educated on what's on the ballot,
Yes.
who the candidates are, maybe even who's running our government. Do you run into that in class, and is there a solution?
I do run into the not only the absence of information, but sometimes misinformation. And I think it may be related to how people access information in the digital age, to the use of social media and those sorts of things. So I do encounter that problem. And I try to convey to people, students in particular, that it's really important to know who's making decisions and who rules you. So one of the things that I try to advocate for the student is to access information from a variety of sources to counteract misinformation or misleading information. The other issue, the way that I try to do this in class, is to bring up ideas or issues or policies that I think may motivate students in particular. So we've talked
For
about...
example,
yeah.
like what might motivate a student?
Well, we've talked about this idea of free higher education when it was first announced, as you were mentioning earlier, by Bernie Sanders. And so we talk about, what that would mean, how it would relate to their cost, what's the benefit of the community investing in people's public education. And what I find, or what I have found, is that even when a policy seems to be specifically focused on the interests of those who are in this age bracket,
Right.
there isn't seemingly interest in it. And so one of the things that happens, that is present, is kind of this problem of the government historically not being responsive to the interests of the young. The young then become alienated from the system, and they get socialized into the belief that the government doesn't care, doesn't pay attention, which then reinforces the government not paying attention. And so there's never a way to kind of...
It's a cycle that needs to be
Yes,
broken, because
yes,
if they're
exactly.
not voting, our candidates then, well, we're going to pander to the people who are voting.
Right, exactly.
For good reason, because they're voting.
Right, exactly.
So, are there any trigger issues that we know of when it comes to young people? I mean, historically, there were lots of protests about the Vietnam War, and then more recently, Bernie Sanders did seem to mobilize a younger base for a time. Are there any things that you think, our students here mentioned that some of the students they interviewed on campus, that Missouri had the CBD kind of medical marijuana question on the ballot, and that might interest them.
Sure.
So do we know if there's trigger issues that would actually motivate them to vote, or is it that they just are interested in it but still might not take that step?
Well, I think issues that kind of impinge on people who, the young tend to be more ideologically liberal relative to other age groups. And so it's interesting that you mentioned CBD or medicinal use of marijuana, because the idea would be, insofar as the young kind of want to be free from the control of others to pursue their own lives, I think policies that deal with those questions are potentially, as you put it, trigger issues. I have noticed, and this is not necessarily one on the agenda in terms of our government specifically, but the decision of the U.S. Supreme Court recently to overrule Roe versus Wade and kind of revolve regulation regarding reproductive freedom to the states. I have noticed more engagement on that issue, but typically it would be from women in classes who feel as if the decision either negatively affects them or creates additional costs for them, but I haven't seen male students respond in the same way. So it would seem like those issues that tend to focus on liberal or at least open views of human life and how they relate to each other, that might be something that I think, so legalization of marijuana might be a good issue in that particular sense.
It does seem like they have other priorities
Yes.
in their life.
Yes.
That, and they want to say other people should vote. I mean, the student told us, oh, they're all for people should vote, but then realistically said, I'm not sure I will. Because it might mean having to take a few extra steps to get an absentee ballot, or they have to register, and some of them haven't yet, even though they could have right when they graduated high school.
Sure.
So those are some of the things that seem to be obstacles. Do you think students and even other voters change their thinking when they're in the job world or buying a house? Or changing in their part of life? Because when you're a student, it's one thing. Do attitudes toward voting change?
Yes, I think. One of the really consistent findings is that as a person ages, they're much more likely to vote. So I think it also associates with higher income and higher education, typically.
Or paying taxes?
Yes, I think so. I think you're right. I think people's life experiences transform how they view their relationship and what they're doing in their life to governmental policies. I also think, and this is not to speak badly of students, because I think they're very intelligent, but sometimes policies are very complex, and so it's not always easy to really know what the correct decision would be in a particular case.
And I'm doing homework. Do I have the time to study up on an election?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's definitely a time constraint. And students here at Missouri Southern in particular, many of them are commuter students, and so they're traveling, they live in different jurisdictions, and you mentioned kind of registration as a cost, reforms to the electoral process that somehow restrict the use of mail-in balloting. Those create further barriers to a population who moves between jurisdictions, and the electoral process isn't really always designed to take into account that movement.
Yeah. Well, we do hope we've got some information out there that we've been posting about absentee balloting. Our county clerks are all willing to help on that. In a nutshell, why do you think it's so important that young people, old people, anyone exercise their right to vote?
Because we get to choose our rulers, and the rulers make decisions that affect our lives. So we should exercise the opportunity to make decisions about who rules us.
And some nations
don't get that option. No, they don't.
Dr. Delahanty, thank you for finishing our episode here on Newsmakers on
Thank you.
voting registration. Glad to have you. And thanks to all our guests as we focus on voting. Thank you for watching Newsmakers. Next week, the battle against breast cancer. Thank you for watching.